For the people who follow me, thank you for trying to follow me. This is going to be explaining one of the playlists here, which is called Game of Four, and that is trying to explain that part, where it came from, which is obvious, the paranormal in some ways. But the difference is, it isn't meant to be the paranormal, not in the sense of uh, looking at that. I have something else set up for that. The idea here is trying to take the playlists and try to show them as books. That's what that is. So this is for Game of Four, trying to explain the characters of Game of Four and what Game of Four is from that side. So the language of Game of Four is numbers. Trying to explain the numbers is very simple. A clock. The first part is one. Hope is always running in the one, which means a second hand, an hour hand. A second hand, a minute hand, very fast. So one is always fast, second or minute hand. Two is always considered an hour hand. Hour hand, essentially, a very slow process of time. Three is the center of a clock. A normal life, you can say, laws, being alive, living in some ways, existing is like some people talk about their schedules. Three, a clock. I'm busy, I have a schedule, so three. Balance, law, order. Four. Four is where things get kind of tricky. Four, it represents the last moment of a life. When I try to explain four, I always say sometimes you look at four representing, like, for example, um, saying goodbye to someone. That moment you look at something, you love someone so much, you look at them and you say, you're saying goodbye in a way. It's four. Four represents, in this piece, a graveyard, a tombstone, in a sense. It's the last moment of a life, you could say. It's four. Five is dead in some ways. You can say that, dead. Hope is always trying to fight death. Death is at the two, which is Raft, who's always an hour hand. So there's a combat between the two characters. One is Raft, who basically is oblivion. Raft. Hope is the one who is trying to save people in some ways. So when you get into five, five is, I found this one time, I was doing some research. Five represents, if you look at the number five, to lie under the grace of God, which essentially you fast. So the piece essentially that is there from year four, again recapping, one is going to be a second hand, a minute hand. Two represents an hour hand. Three represents the center of a clock, balance. Four essentially represents the last moment of a life, or goodbye, or the tombstone. When you look at and hear something like 4 to 1, it's essentially a protest of death. You don't want to die, in a sense. So 4 to 1 represents essentially five, but it is the self fighting essentially death. I don't want to die. 1 to 4 represents birth. You never quite get to five in some ways. So 1 to 4 is birth. 4 to 1 represents essentially death. When you get into trying to explain this idea, that's what I said when I started doing this again. I was not interested in people following me. I like people following and then doing videos which are coherent videos, but this is doing essentially a massive idea, and these are books in some way. So the playlist will eventually start morphing into those books and the characters. Explaining the characters, who's Oblivion, essentially, and when you hear the word cookie, someone is rebooting all of these characters, and that is JoJo. JoJo is the one who's rebooting all these things. Someone is saying something to her and forcing all this to restart again, all over again.